soft piano fades in, a gentle rain tapping against the window. Daniel Brooks sat at the edge of his bed, fingers tracing the old silver watch Grace had given him years ago. Outside, the Oregon sky was gray, heavy with the kind of quiet that never really leaves you. 2 years had passed since the accident, yet every morning still began with the same whisper. Come on, Dan, just breathe. He thought moving across the country, taking a new job, starting fresh, might wash away the ache. But grief doesn't pack neatly into boxes. It lingers in the smell of coffee, in the songs she used to hum, in the echo of her laughter that sometimes still finds him when the world grows still. Tomorrow, he'll meet his new boss at Aurora Financial, a woman known for her precision, her strength, her calm authority. Daniel tells himself, this is a new beginning, a chance to rebuild the man he used to be. Yet life has a way of weaving the past into the present, often in the most unexpected forms. And when he finally meets her, one simple detail will shake everything he thought he had buried. Morning light spilled through the blinds, painting thin gold lines across the small kitchen. The smell of coffee filled the air strong, a little burnt, the way Daniel Brooks liked it. He stood by the window, mug in hand, watching the fog lift slowly over the pine trees behind his house. The Oregon countryside was quiet this time of year, too quiet, sometimes, somewhere in the distance. A train horn echoed long, low, and lonely. Daniel closed his eyes for a second. The sound reminded him of Boston mornings, when he and Grace would rush out the door, half late for work, laughing over who'd forgotten the car keys. He could still hear her voice, light and teasing. You'd lose your head if I didn't keep it attached. Dan? He took another sip of coffee and set the mug down. The rim left a small brown ring on the counter. Everything here was neat, controlled. The walls freshly painted, the floor spotless as if order could keep the grief from seeping through. 2 years. That's how long it had been since the accident, and yet, some mornings felt like day one. He reached for his tie, fumbling with the knot in the hallway mirror. The reflection that looked back at him was older than he remembered faint lines near the eyes, the kind carved by loss, not by time. He forced a half smile. Come on, Dan, he murmured, adjusting the tie again. Just breathe. The house was too still. He left the TV off. No music, just the sound of his footsteps on the wooden floor as he grabbed his worn leather briefcase and headed out the door. Outside, the air was cool and damp. His old Ford pickup waited in the driveway, its engine coughing to life before settling into a quiet rumble. The drive to town took 20 minutes, winding roads bordered by evergreens, the kind that seemed to stretch forever. For a moment, he imagined Grace sitting in the passenger seat, hair blowing near the open window, humming along to some old Springsteen song. But when he glanced over, there was only the faint reflection of himself in the glass. Aurora Financial was a low, modern building on the edge of town, glass panels, pale gray stone, the kind of architecture meant to look comforting yet important. Daniel parked, straightened his tie again, and took a slow breath. His first day, a new chapter, people would say, a clean slate, but clean slates still carry the shadow of what was erased. Inside, the lobby smelled of polished wood and fresh paper. A young receptionist smiled at him from behind a curved desk. Good morning. You must be Mr. Brooks? He nodded. First day jitters, I guess. She laughed politely. You'll fit right in. Everyone's talking about the new branch manager coming in today, too. Big changes ahead. Is that right? He asked, forcing a small smile. Oh, yes, she said, lowering her voice as if sharing a secret. They say she turned a failing office in Seattle into one of the top-performing branches in less than a year. People call her the Ice Queen, but in a good way. Daniel chuckled under his breath. An Ice Queen. Sounded like the kind of person who would never forget which drawer the car keys were in. He found his desk near the window tidy, minimal, with a view of the town square and the distant ridge beyond. As he unpacked his things, a framed photo of his parents, a fountain pen, a small fern. Grace had once given him, he noticed his hands trembling slightly. He steadied them on the desk. It was just nerves, he told himself. New job, new people, nothing more. By mid-morning, the office buzzed with quiet anticipation. Someone had brought pastries. People gathered near the elevators, pretending not to stare each time the doors opened. Daniel stayed at his desk, pretending to read an email he hadn't finished drafting. Then the elevator chimed. The doors slid open, and conversation stopped. A woman stepped out tall, composed, wearing a dark gray suit that fit her like it was made for her. Her hair was pulled back neatly, a few strands softening her face. She moved with a calm confidence, the kind that made people instinctively straighten their posture. But it wasn't her poise that caught Daniel's breath. It was the glint of silver around her neck, a necklace, thin and simple, with a pale blue stone that caught the light. He blinked once, twice. His heart tripped over itself. That necklace. It looked familiar. Too familiar. The memory came rushing in Grace's laughter on a snowy night, the small velvet box in his hand, the way her eyes filled when she saw it. "It's beautiful," she'd whispered. "But there's a tiny dent here." He had smiled then, kissing her forehead. The flaw makes it real. Now, standing across the room, that same imperfection glimmered faintly in the light. Daniel's breath hitched. He gripped the edge of his desk, feeling the blood drain from his face. Surely it was a coincidence. There had to be thousands of necklaces like it. But something deep inside him, the same instinct that had once known Grace's footsteps before she spoke, told him otherwise. He couldn't look away. As she introduced herself, Madeline Foster, branch director, her voice was calm, warm even. People nodded, smiled, murmured greetings. Daniel barely heard a word. His eyes followed the movement of that necklace as it rose and fell with her breath. When she turned slightly, the silver caught the light again, and for a split second, he thought he saw at the faint engraving near the clasp. 2 letters, D and G. He felt something twist in his chest, a small, sharp ache, the kind that memory carries like a whisper you can't unhear. For the rest of the morning, Daniel worked mechanically. Numbers blurred on the screen. Conversations drifted past him. He laughed when others laughed, nodded when expected. But his mind was elsewhere, looping around the impossible question: how could she have Grace's necklace at lunch? He walked to the break room, poured himself a cup of stale coffee, and stood by the window again. The rain had started, light and steady. Drops slid down the glass, blurring the world outside. He told himself not to read into it. People donate things. Jewelry gets lost, resold. It doesn't mean anything. And yet, when he closed his eyes, he saw Grace's hands, pale and delicate, fastening that very chain around her neck. He remembered the way she'd touched it whenever she was nervous, a small, unconscious gesture. A tap on the door pulled him back. His new co-worker, a young man named Eric, leaned in. "Hey, Brooks, you coming to the team meeting?" The boss is introducing herself. "Yeah," Daniel said, voice quiet. "I'll be right there." He set down his coffee, straightened his tie, and took one last look out the window. The rain was heavier now, streaking down in silver lines. For a brief moment, he thought he saw his own reflection shift, not the tired man he'd become, but the one he used to be, the one who still believed in second chances. He drew a slow breath and whispered again, "Come on, Dan, just breathe." Then he turned toward the conference room, unaware that the next few minutes would change everything. He thought he knew not just about the past, but about what it means to begin again. The rain had stopped sometime before dawn, but the air still carried that aftertaste of damp earth and pine. A soft chill drifted through the half-open window, brushing against the back of Daniel's neck as he stood before the mirror. The tie hung crooked in his hands. He tried again. The knot wouldn't sit right. It never did on mornings like this. The reflection staring back at him looked tired, older than 42, eyes rimmed with the kind of sleeplessness that no amount of coffee could disguise. He inhaled once, slow, steady, then whispered, barely moving his lips, Come on, Dan. Just breathe. It was less a pep talk than a ritual, something to keep the ghosts quiet. He tightened the tie anyway and reached for his jacket. The fabric smelled faintly of cedar and detergent, the scent of order in a life that had forgotten how to feel whole. The clock on the kitchen wall ticked towards 7. He poured himself another cup of coffee, let it cool, then left it untouched on the counter. Outside, the sky was still half gray. Mist rose from the asphalt like smoke, curling around the tires of his pickup. The drive to work felt longer today. Though the distance hadn't changed, every mile stretched, every curve of the road pulling up pieces of memory he thought he'd already buried. A blue scarf fluttering in winter wind. The sound of her laugh carried through the car radio. The world before the siren, before the call, before the silence. He rolled the window down a few inches, letting the morning air sting his face. Maybe the cold could keep him present. Maybe it could drown out the hum of memory that never really left. At Aurora Financial, the parking lot glistened with leftover rain. A few early risers hurried inside, balancing coffee cups and phones. Daniel lingered by the door, watching his reflection in the glass, the faint outline of a man pretending to belong somewhere. Inside, the hum of fluorescent lights greeted him, the steady rhythm of printers and keyboards filling the silence he'd carried from home. He sat at his desk, placed his briefcase neatly beside the chair, and tried to lose himself in numbers. Spreadsheets didn't ask questions. They didn't remember, but his focus broke when the elevator chimed again. Madeline Foster stepped out, composed as ever, speaking softly with a colleague. That same necklace rested against her collarbone, catching the overhead light. Daniel's hand froze on the mouse. He forced his eyes back to the monitor, but the image lingered in his mind like a pulse. The color of that stone, that impossible blue. The small dent near the clasp, barely visible but carved into his memory. He told himself not to stare, not to think, not to hope. Yet part of him, the part that refused to be reasonable, whispered questions he couldn't silence. How did she get it? Did she know Grace? Did she know me? A voice snapped him back. Eric, from accounting, leaned over the divider. Hey, man, you doing okay? You look like you saw a ghost. Daniel forced a smile. Guess I'm still fighting jet lag. Eric chuckled. You moved 2 time zones, not 6. Yeah, Daniel said softly, still catching up. When Eric left, Daniel rubbed his temples, eyes closed. The hum of the office blended with the ticking clock, creating a steady beat that reminded him of a hospital monitor, that slow, fading rhythm he once prayed would stay steady. He pushed back from the desk and stood by the window. The view overlooked the town square, where shop signs flickered to life and people crossed the street with steaming cups in hand. Life, ordinary and unbothered, kept moving. He envied that, the ease of people untouched by loss. Behind him, laughter rose from a cluster of desks. Madeline was there, speaking with the team, her voice even, unhurried. When she smiled, it wasn't the icy expression people whispered about. It was warm, real. For a second, Daniel forgot to breathe. He turned away quickly, ashamed of the thought that followed. She shouldn't be able to smile like Grace did. The guilt came fast after that. He wasn't comparing. He couldn't. But the resemblance in small things, the tilt of her head, the calm in her voice, it stirred something he didn't want to name. By lunchtime, the sky had cleared. Sunlight poured through the windows, scattering across desks and screens. Daniel decided to step out for air. The small courtyard behind the building was lined with lavender and mint, still wet from rain. He sat on a bench, closed his eyes, and inhaled the scent. It was grounding, almost. The wind moved gently through the leaves, whispering against his sleeve. For the first time all morning, he felt a flicker of quiet. Then footsteps approached. He opened his eyes. Madeline stood a few feet away, holding a paper cup. She smiled politely. I hope I'm not stealing your spot. It's the only peaceful corner in this place. Her voice was calm, but there was a note of weariness under it, like she understood something about quiet that most people didn't. Daniel hesitated, then nodded toward the bench. Plenty of room. She sat, careful, keeping a polite distance. The scent of her coffee vanilla and cinnamon drifted between them. For a moment, neither spoke. Just the hum of wind and a faint drip from the eaves above. Daniel glanced at the necklace. The stone caught the light, soft and blue as a memory. Words slipped out before he could stop them. That necklace. It's beautiful. Madeline looked down at it, fingers brushing the chain. For the briefest moment, something flickered across her face. Surprise? Maybe recognition? Then she smiled. Thank you. It's an old piece. Daniel nodded, unsure what to say next. The silence stretched, but it wasn't uncomfortable. More like the kind of silence that lets two people breathe in the same rhythm. After a while, she stood. I should get back. Big day. He smiled faintly. Yeah, first days always are. When she walked away, Daniel stayed seated, eyes following the sway of that silver chain as it disappeared through the doorway. He felt the old ache stir again, deeper this time. The kind that wasn't pain anymore, but something closer to longing. He pressed his palms together, elbows resting on his knees, and stared at the ground. A small puddle near his shoe reflected a thin piece of sky, pale and trembling. He didn't know why, but it reminded him of the day Grace had said yes, how the world had seemed to tilt slightly toward light. He closed his eyes. For the first time since she died, the memory didn't crush him. It just lingered, soft, distant. The clock tower in town began to chime noon, its sound drifting through the courtyard. Daniel exhaled slowly, almost a whisper. Come on, Dan, just breathe. He stood, brushed the rain from his sleeve, and walked back toward the building. Somewhere deep down, beneath the weight of grief and questions he couldn't yet ask, something faint began to move. Not hope exactly, but the memory of how hope once felt. And as he stepped through the glass doors, sunlight spilled across the floor, a single, quiet promise that the darkness, however heavy, was beginning to thin. The afternoon sun poured through the wide glass windows of Aurora Financial, softening the sharp edges of the office. Dust motes floated lazily in the light, tiny reminders that even stillness could move. Daniel sat at his desk, pretending to read a report he hadn't processed a single word of. The ink swam on the page. His mind was still somewhere between the courtyard and that brief conversation the way Madeline's voice had settled the air. Calm, but not cold. And how the glint of silver at her throat had caught him off guard all over again. He tried to focus. Numbers were safe. Numbers didn't hurt. But every time he blinked, that necklace appeared behind his eyelids, gleaming softly like a heartbeat in metal. A light knock at his desk divider. Team meeting starting, Eric said. Come on before the boss thinks we're hiding. Daniel rose, smoothing his tie, feeling a small knot twist low in his chest. He followed the others down the corridor toward the main conference room. The walls were lined with framed photos, smiling teams, corporate retreats, group handshakes frozen in good lighting. He used to be in photos like that once. Before everything went quiet, inside, the air buzzed with polite chatter. Everyone was waiting. Then, just as the room settled, the elevator chimed again. The door slid open. Madeline Foster stepped out. The first thing Daniel noticed was how still the room became, as if even the hum of the fluorescent lights dimmed to let her presence fill the space. She walked with the unhurried grace of someone who belonged anywhere she stood. A charcoal gray suit, a soft white blouse, and around her neck the same delicate chain, silver, worn close to the skin. Daniel's breath faltered. The world seemed to tilt just slightly, like a camera lens slipping out of focus. Madeline reached the front of the room, smiled briefly, and introduced herself. Her voice was even, warm but measured. Good morning, everyone. I'm honored to be joining Aurora Financial. I've heard wonderful things about this team. She paused, scanning faces, her gaze calm and steady. We've got work ahead, but I believe in people before systems. If you give me your effort, I'll give you my trust. The words fell simply, but something about the way she said them, without arrogance, without performance, made Daniel look up. He wanted to focus on the tone, the rhythm of her words, but his eyes betrayed him, drawn again to that flicker of blue against her collarbone, Grace's necklace. He could see it now, clearly, the same oval stone, translucent like shallow ocean water, and he swallowed hard the same faint scratch on the clasp, the one Grace had laughed about years ago when he first fastened it around her neck. The flaw makes it real. The meeting continued, voices blending, papers shuffling. Daniel barely heard a thing. He felt like he was underwater, every sound muffled, distant. When it ended, he stood too quickly, knocking his pen to the floor. It clattered and rolled toward her feet. Madeline bent down first, picked it up before he could. "Here," she said, offering it with a small smile. "Thanks," he murmured, their eyes meeting for the briefest moment. And in that second, something familiar flickered. Not recognition, but resonance. Like hearing a song you didn't realize you remembered. She turned to greet another employee, and Daniel stood frozen for a moment longer, the air thick in his lungs. Then, instinctively, he reached for the ring he still wore on a chain under his shirt. Grace's engagement ring, small, simple, worn smooth by his thumb over time. Later, back at his desk, the office hummed around him again. The world, for everyone else, was ordinary. For him, it was trembling. He opened his email, trying to drown in work, but every reflection computer screen, glass divider, window kept catching that same shimmer of silver across the room. By afternoon, he could no longer sit still. He walked to the small kitchenette, poured himself water, then lingered by the window overlooking the parking lot. The sky had turned a pale, washed-out blue, the kind that looks cold even when it's not. He caught his reflection in the glass again, tie loosened, eyes shadowed, and thought about how tired he looked, how much energy it took to hold himself together. A voice broke the quiet. "Long day already." He turned. Madeline stood by the counter, stirring cream into her coffee. He nodded, just getting back into the rhythm of things. "I know how that feels," she said softly, then added, "New beginnings are strange. They feel light, but they carry weight." He studied her for a moment, unsure what to say. There was something in her tone and undercurrent, as if she, too, had carried her share of ghosts. Her phone buzzed, pulling her attention. She excused herself with a polite nod and disappeared down the hall. Daniel exhaled, realizing he'd been holding his breath the whole time. That evening, the office emptied slowly. Outside, the sky dimmed to lavender. He stayed behind, half pretending to finish a report, though the truth was he couldn't yet leave, not while that question kept echoing. He glanced across the room one last time before shutting down his computer. Her office door stood slightly ajar, a warm light spilling from inside. He could see her silhouette, bent over a stack of folders. The necklace glimmered faintly when she moved. He hesitated, then walked toward the elevator. But just as he reached the hallway, a voice called from behind. "Mr. Brooks." He turned. Madeline was standing by her doorway, holding a folder. "I wanted to say thank you for your input during the meeting. Your background's impressive. I'm looking forward to learning from your experience." Daniel blinked, caught off guard. "Oh, thank you, ma'am. I mean, Madeline." She smiled, the corners of her eyes softening. "Good night, Daniel." As she turned back into her office, he caught one last glimpse of the necklace against the lamplight. It shone pale blue, the same way Grace's had shimmered on that winter night years ago when she danced barefoot in their tiny apartment. He stood in the quiet corridor long after she'd gone, the echo of her voice fading into the hum of the lights. The world around him felt suddenly thin, like paper about to tear. When he finally stepped into the elevator, he pressed the button, then stared at his reflection in the steel doors. His eyes looked distant, haunted, But beneath that, something else stirred, a tremor he couldn't name. The doors closed slowly. The faint reflection of the blue stone lingered for half a heartbeat before the metal sealed shut. And, as the elevator descended, Daniel whispered the only words he knew how to say. "Come on, Dan. Just breathe." Outside, the last light of day bled into dusk, soft and uncertain, as if the night itself was holding its breath waiting for what would come next. That night, the office emptied one by one until only the hum of the air vents and the soft ticking of the wall clock remained. Daniel sat at his desk long after everyone had gone, the glow from his computer casting faint blue light across his hands. Outside, the Oregon rain had started again, whispering against the windows steady, unhurried, like the rhythm of memory itself. He should have gone home an hour ago, but his mind refused to rest. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the necklace, swaying gently against the soft fabric of her blouse. That flash of blue, that impossible familiarity. He stood, restless, and wandered through the dim corridors. Most of the lights had been turned off, leaving only thin strips of silver light spilling from office doors. As he passed Madeline's office, he hesitated. Her door was ajar. Inside, a lamp glowed on her desk, casting a warm circle of light over scattered papers. But she was gone. Her chair was empty. He took a step closer, just one. The necklace lay on the desk, beside a file folder and a pair of reading glasses. The silver chain caught the lamplight, shimmering faintly. For a moment, Daniel thought his heart had stopped altogether. He could hear nothing but the low hum of the lights and the uneven rhythm of his own breathing. He reached out slow, uncertain, and his fingers hovered just above it. He knew he shouldn't. He was invading something private, but the pull was stronger than reason. He only meant to look. The stone was cool, smooth, and impossibly familiar beneath his fingertips. The same shade of ocean blue he remembered from that night in Boston, when snow fell softly outside their apartment window. He turned it gently in his hand, and there it was, the small, imperfect dent on the back, like a half-moon pressed into the silver. His breath hitched, and then, just below it, faint but unmistakable, the engraving D and G. Daniel's hand trembled. The air around him seemed to thin. The world shrank to the size of that tiny inscription. D and G, Daniel and Grace. A memory flooded in, warm, vivid, and cruel. He was standing in the little jewelry shop on Tremont Street, the one Grace had loved because it always smelled faintly of sandalwood. The old craftsman had apologized for the small imperfection near the clasp. "We can fix that," the man had said. But Grace had shaken her head, smiling. "No, leave it," she'd said, her eyes bright. "The flaw makes it real." Her laughter echoed in his mind, that soft, melodic sound that had once filled every corner of his life. He could see her again, sitting on the floor of their apartment in her worn sweatshirt, hair tied up, holding that same necklace up to the light, teasing. "You know, Dan, if I ever lose this, you'll have to find it. Promise." He had laughed then. He had promised. Now, standing in the dim office, he felt the weight of that promise crush him. His chest tightened. His hand fell away from the necklace as if it burned. He stepped back, unsteady, his breath shallow. He didn't know what to think. How could it be here? How could someone else wear something so intimately tied to the life he'd lost? The elevator dinged faintly at the end of the hall. Footsteps approached, measured, confident. He froze. Madeline appeared in the doorway, startled for half a heartbeat when she saw him. Daniel. He straightened too quickly, nearly knocking a chair leg against the desk. I was just about to leave. I thought everyone was gone." She smiled faintly, setting her bag down. "Almost. I forgot a few files." Her gaze followed his to the necklace on the desk. "Oh." She reached for it casually. "Guess I left this behind again." Daniel's throat tightened. He forced a polite nod. "It's beautiful." Madeline smiled. Thank you. It's old. Been with me for years. She clasped it around her neck, fingers brushing the back of the chain. A little scratched up now, but I can't seem to part with it. Her voice softened as she looked up. You okay? Daniel? You look pale. He wanted to say yes, wanted to sound normal, but the words tangled somewhere in his chest. Just tired, I guess. Long day. She nodded with quiet understanding. First weeks are always the hardest. Everything feels heavier until it starts to fit. He managed a small smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. Yeah, something like that. She gathered her papers, then paused, glancing at him again, her expression thoughtful, almost kind. Sometimes starting over doesn't mean forgetting. It just means learning how to carry things differently. He looked at her then, really looked, and for a moment, he couldn't tell if she was talking to him or herself. After she left, Daniel stood alone in the glow of the desk lamp. Her words lingered, soft as the rain outside, learning how to carry things differently. He shut his eyes. For the first time in years, the memory of Grace didn't come like a blade. It came like light breaking through fog, sharp, but strangely gentle. He turned off the lamp, the office falling into darkness, except for the faint city glow spilling through the blinds. As he walked toward the elevator, his reflection caught briefly in the glass. Tired, yes, but something else too. A question, a tremor. He pressed the button. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime. Behind him, through the quiet hallway, the faint glimmer of that blue stone still shimmered in the dark. He didn't know what it meant yet, whether it was coincidence or something else entirely. But deep down, beneath the ache, beneath the fear, he felt it, the small, undeniable hum of something waking up inside him, something that felt dangerously like hope. And as the elevator doors closed, he whispered the words again, barely audible over the sound of rain. Come on, Dan, just breathe. The following morning, the sun crept slowly through the blinds of Daniel's small kitchen, painting pale stripes across the counter. He sat in silence, staring at his untouched toast. The coffee had long gone cold. He'd barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, that image returned: the silver chain in Madeline's hand, the soft way she'd said, I can't seem to part with it. He wanted to believe it was coincidence. The world was full of lookalikes, duplicates, copies of things once unique. But that engraving D&G, it was like seeing a ghost etched in metal. No one could replicate that. No one but her. At work, everything felt slightly off-kilter. The office buzzed with the usual rhythm, phones ringing, keyboards clicking, laughter from across the room, but for Daniel, it all came through a haze, like a radio between stations. Madeline's voice would rise now and then, calm and composed, guiding the team through plans and deadlines. And every time he heard it, something deep inside him stirred. He tried not to watch her, but it was impossible. His eyes betrayed him. The way she leaned forward when reading, chin resting lightly on her hand. Grace used to do that too. The way she'd smile at small things. A gentle curve that reached her eyes, identical. Even the soft hum she made when concentrating, barely audible, but enough to pull at some fragile thread of memory. He told himself he was imagining it, shaping her into someone she wasn't. But grief has its own imagination, cruel, persistent, convincing. By mid-morning, the tension inside him had built into something heavy. He needed air. He stepped outside to the courtyard again. The lavender brushed lightly against his sleeve, releasing its scent into the breeze. He closed his eyes, trying to steady his breathing. Rough day already. The voice startled him. Madeline stood by the door, holding 2 cups of coffee. She offered one. Peace offering, she said lightly. I noticed you always drink it black. Daniel hesitated before taking it. You didn't have to. I wanted to, she said simply, sitting beside him on the stone bench. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence between them was strangely soft, almost comfortable. He watched the sunlight flicker through the leaves, landing on her wrist, her collarbone, the edge of the silver chain. It caught the light just enough to pull him back into the past. Grace again standing in their kitchen, early morning, hair messy, necklace glinting against her skin as she turned toward him with a sleepy smile. "Don't just stare. Dan, say something." The echo made his throat tighten. Madeline sipped her coffee, unaware of the storm she'd just walked into. "You know," she said, eyes on the garden, "I moved here for a fresh start, too. New town, new air. But it turns out the past packs itself into every box, no matter how hard you try to leave it behind." Daniel glanced at her, startled. "Yeah," he said quietly. "It does." She smiled faintly, not pressing further. "Anyway, you're doing great work already. The team seems to like you." He nodded, but the words barely reached him. His thoughts were looping around her necklace again, how it caught the sun, how it seemed to hum against her heartbeat. When she left, Daniel stayed behind, holding the cup she'd given him, now half empty. The scent of coffee mingled with lavender, and for a second, the world tilted, Grace's laughter overlapping Madeline's voice. Two women sharing one shape in his mind. That afternoon, he caught himself staring again. Madeline was across the room, reviewing reports with a few team members. The light from the window framed her profile, calm, confident, alive. He should have looked away, but something about her presence was magnetic, haunting. He could feel the pull of recognition, stronger each time. When she glanced up suddenly, their eyes met. He froze. For a heartbeat. Something passed between them, not understanding exactly, but awareness, like two people remembering the same song at different parts of their lives. She smiled, polite, and turned back to her work. Daniel forced himself to focus on the spreadsheet before him, but the numbers refused to stay still. Why her? Why that necklace? The questions circled him like crows, restless and unrelenting. That evening, after everyone had gone, he stayed again. The office lights dimmed to a soft glow. He walked past her empty desk, stopping by the window. The night outside was draped in mist, the town lights blurred like candle flames. He pressed his hand against the glass. It was cool beneath his palm. He whispered to the reflection staring back. "If this is some kind of sign, Grace, I don't understand it." The words sounded foolish, but saying them out loud felt like release. He hadn't spoken her name in months. He turned, glancing once more toward her office. The necklace wasn't there tonight. She must have taken it home. The thought ached and comforted him at once. As he packed his bag, he noticed something on his desk, a folded note. Just a short message in her neat handwriting. "Thanks for your help today. M." He stared at the note longer than necessary. 3 lines, nothing special, yet his pulse picked up anyway. The next morning, he arrived early. The office was quiet, only the soft hum of lights overhead. He sat at his desk, staring at the empty chair across the room. When the elevator finally chimed, he looked up. Madeline stepped out, hair slightly tousled, a travel mug in hand. The necklace was there again, glinting softly against her collarbone. Daniel's breath caught not from shock this time, but from something gentler, something dangerously close to tenderness. He realized then, with quiet dread, that he wasn't just haunted anymore. He was drawn, and that scared him more than anything. Because love, once lost, shouldn't have a second face. He turned back to his computer, forcing his focus on the screen. The hum of the office slowly grew around him. But deep down, under every word, every breath, the question kept pulsing in his chest. Why does she have that necklace? The answer waited somewhere ahead, just beyond his reach. And for now, all he could do was what he'd always done. Breathe. Just breathe. The air outside carried the soft scent of mint and damp soil. It was lunchtime, though Daniel hadn't eaten a thing. He needed quiet more than food. The small terrace behind the building, half garden, half forgotten corner, had become his refuge these past weeks. Rows of potted lavender lined the railing, their purple tips swaying gently under the Oregon sun. Someone had planted mint, too. Its fragrance rose when the wind shifted, clean and sharp. Daniel leaned against the low wall, coffee cup in hand, watching the shadows of the leaves move across the concrete floor. The world felt slower here, as if time paused just long enough for him to breathe. A door creaked open behind him. Footsteps, light but certain. Then her voice, warm, familiar now, drifted across the quiet. "I thought I'd find you here." He turned. Madeline stood a few steps away, holding a ceramic mug, the kind people kept at their desks. Steam curled up from it, carrying the faint sweetness of vanilla. She smiled, almost shyly. "It's the only peaceful corner here," she said. He managed a small smile. "Yeah. The rest of the place feels like a storm sometimes." She stepped closer, looking out over the garden. The light caught her hair, turning the brown strands almost golden at the edges. For a moment, they stood in silence, just listening to the hum of distant traffic, to the lazy buzz of a bee hovering near the lavender. Madeline sipped her coffee. "You like quiet places," she said, not as a question, but as an observation. Daniel nodded. "I used to think silence was lonely. Now, I think it's just honest." She looked at him for a second longer than necessary, then turned her gaze back to the plants. The silver necklace shifted slightly as she moved, catching the sunlight. The blue stone glimmered, swaying just above her heart. Daniel's fingers tightened around his cup. He hadn't meant to look. He hadn't meant to notice. But the movement was magnetic. The light seemed to hold the air still for a beat too long. Before he could stop himself, the words slipped out quiet, unplanned. "That necklace. It's beautiful." Madeline froze for the briefest moment. Her hand lifted, brushing the pendant as if she'd only just remembered it was there. "Oh, thank you," she said softly. "It's old, kind of a keepsake." Her voice had changed lighter on the surface, but there was something under it, like a note of hesitation she was trying to hide. Daniel's pulse thudded in his ears. "It suits you," he said carefully, almost whispering. Madeline gave a small smile, the kind that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm glad you think so." The silence stretched again, this time heavier, threaded with unspoken things. She took another sip of coffee, looking out over the lavender. "I didn't realize anyone else came out here," she said. "I don't think anyone does," Daniel replied. "That's the best part." A small laugh escaped her, barely a sound. "You know, most people fill every silence. You don't. It's different." He looked at her then, meeting her eyes. "Sometimes silence says what words can't." She nodded slowly, as if she understood exactly what he meant. For a long moment, neither of them looked away. The wind shifted again, brushing the hem of her jacket, sending a faint shiver through the leaves. And just like that, the spell broke. Madeline cleared her throat gently, setting her cup down on the railing. "I should get back," she said. "Too many emails waiting to ruin my day." Daniel smiled faintly. "I know the feeling." She turned to go, then paused, glancing back. The sunlight struck the necklace once more, a brief flash of blue against her skin. "You should come out here more often," she said. "It's a shame to let peace go to waste." And then she was gone, leaving only the fading echo of her footsteps and the lingering scent of coffee and vanilla in the air. Daniel stayed there, motionless. His hand brushed the railing where her cup had rested, still faintly warm. He exhaled slowly, trying to untangle the rush of emotions inside him. Confusion, longing, fear. He looked toward the horizon, where the line of pines cut against the pale sky. "You're seeing ghosts," he told himself. "You're chasing shadows." But the memory wouldn't let go. The curve of her smile. The way she had touched that necklace not casually, but protectively, almost reverently. It was exactly how Grace used to. He pressed his thumb and forefinger together, remembering the texture of that same chain years ago, cool and smooth against his skin as he'd fastened it around Grace's neck. "Promise me," she had said, laughing softly. "If I ever lose it, you'll find it." He had promised, now, staring into the sunlight. He wondered if somehow, in some impossible way, he was keeping that promise without knowing it. A faint sound broke the quiet. The soft chime of the office clock through the open door. Lunch was nearly over. Daniel took one last breath of the lavender-laced air and straightened his jacket. He turned to leave, but stopped halfway, looking back at the empty bench. A single sprig of mint had fallen onto the seat, green and fragrant. He picked it up, rolling it gently between his fingers, letting its scent linger. The world felt delicate in that moment, fragile, uncertain, but alive. As he walked back inside, the hum of office life grew louder, swallowing the quiet. Still, in his chest, something faint began to move again. Not peace exactly, but a tremor, like a heart remembering how to feel. And as he passed by the reflection of the glass door, he caught a glimpse of himself, eyes softer than before, shoulders less heavy. For the first time in a long time, he didn't look like a man running from the past. He looked like someone who might finally be ready to face it. But deep inside, one question kept circling, quiet but relentless. Why does she have that necklace outside? The wind stirred the lavender again, carrying a single petal into the hallway before the door swung shut. That night, the office was empty again, the kind of quiet that settles thick, like dust on forgotten shelves. Outside, the rain had returned gentle this time, a soft tapping against the wide glass windows. Most of the building had gone dark, except for the faint pool of light spilling from Daniel's desk. He told himself he was catching up on work, but he knew why he stayed. His computer screen glowed, numbers blurring in front of him, but his focus was somewhere else down the hall, in the small glass-walled office where Madeline had left her things. She'd gone home an hour ago, after a long meeting. She'd said goodnight with her usual calm smile, the necklace glinting faintly as she turned away. That image hadn't left him since now. As the minutes slipped past, he found himself standing, pacing. His pulse was a steady drum in his chest. He walked toward her office, his steps quiet against the carpet. The door wasn't locked. It never was. Inside, the air smelled faintly of lavender, maybe from her perfume, or the hand cream she used. The desk lamp was still on, a soft, amber glow. Files were stacked neatly beside her laptop, a half-empty glass of water beside them, and there resting against a stack of folders was the necklace. It caught the light even before he reached for it. The blue stone gleamed like a drop of ocean captured in the silver. His hand trembled as he picked it up, careful not to disturb anything else. It was lighter than he remembered, but the shape, the small imperfections, they were exactly the same. He turned it gently between his fingers, and the memories rose vivid, alive. Grace's laughter echoing through their apartment, her hair falling loose around her shoulders as she'd turned toward him. The night he'd given it to her, a cold winter evening in Boston, the kind where the air stung but the city lights felt warm. He could see it all. He'd been nervous then, clumsy with words. They'd gone to dinner at that little Italian place near the river, the one with candles and wine bottles. After dessert, he'd pulled the small velvet box from his coat pocket. Grace had laughed through tears when she opened it. "It's beautiful," she'd whispered, tracing the stone with her finger. Then she'd noticed the tiny dent near the clasp. "It's not perfect." And he'd said, "The flaw makes it real." She had looked at him for a long moment then, eyes glistening, before saying softly, "Even when two tides drift apart, they find their way home." He could still hear her voice now, the calm certainty in it, the quiet promise that love, once true, never really left. The weight of that memory pressed against his chest. His throat ached. He blinked hard, trying to steady himself, but the room blurred at the edges. He turned the necklace over once more, and there it was. The engraving, D and G, his initials, hers, the proof. Daniel's breath caught, sharp and unsteady. The world seemed to still the hum of the lights, the sound of rain. Everything paused. There was no mistaking it now. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't a look-alike. This was Grace's necklace. The realization hit him like a wave, pulling him under. How could it be here? How could she have it? He sank into the nearest chair, the necklace still in his hand, his mind spinning through impossible explanations. Had someone sold it? Had her things been donated? Was it a gift passed on by chance? Each theory only deepened the ache. He looked up at the ceiling, at the thin beam of light stretching across the floor, and whispered, "Grace, what are you trying to tell me?" The silence that followed was almost kind. He placed the necklace back exactly where it had been, his fingers lingering for just a second longer than they should. Then he stood, unsteady, and turned off the lamp. The room dimmed to a soft half-light, shadows wrapping around the walls. As he walked back to his desk, the echo of Grace's voice followed him, faint, like a dream half-remembered. Even when two tides drift apart, they find their way home. He sat down again, his head in his hands. The words wouldn't leave him. Outside, the rain grew heavier, sliding down the glass in winding trails. The city lights shimmered through them like distant stars. Daniel stared out, lost in thought, his reflection faintly visible in the window, tired eyes, drawn face, but behind them, something shifting. It wasn't just grief anymore, it was wonder and fear. If Grace's necklace had somehow found its way here to Madeline, then what else had crossed unseen paths between the past and the present? The air in the office felt charged, alive with a strange electricity. Daniel leaned back in his chair, exhaling a shaky breath. Maybe it was fate, maybe coincidence, or maybe the universe wasn't as careless as he'd believed. He didn't know which scared him more, the thought that Grace was gone completely, or the possibility that some part of her was still here, reaching out through time and strangers to find him again. He looked at the clock, almost midnight. The office was silent now, save for the soft rain and the low hum of the lights. Slowly, he stood, gathering his things. Before leaving, he turned once more toward Madeline's office. The door was closed now, but he could still see the faint blue glow reflecting off the glass, the necklace catching the last bit of lamplight from inside. It pulsed like a heartbeat. He stood there for a long time, just watching, until the reflection dimmed and the room fell into darkness. And in that darkness, a thought came to him, one that he couldn't shake. Maybe two tides really do find their way home. When he finally stepped out into the rain, it was cold, but he didn't lift his collar or hurry to the car. He let it fall on his face, washing something away, fear, maybe, or the stubborn disbelief that had kept him numb for so long. The road ahead shimmered with puddles and streetlight reflections. He walked slowly, feeling the rhythm of each drop against his skin, and for the first time in years, he whispered her name without breaking. Grace. The sound of it lingered in the rain, soft, steady, alive, and somewhere, behind the closed doors of Aurora Financial, a blue stone glimmered faintly in the dark, like the echo of a promise that refused to fade. The days that followed felt different, quieter, though not in a peaceful way. More like the world had slowed down, waiting for Daniel to notice something he wasn't yet ready to see. At work, he moved through the motions, answering emails, reviewing reports, sitting through meetings, but beneath it all, a current of thought kept tugging at him. Madeline, the necklace, the impossible truth that had settled into his chest like a secret only he could feel. He told himself to stay composed, to act normal, but his eyes had their own will. They kept finding her across the room, the way she adjusted her glasses when reading, the faint hum she made when thinking, the patient way she listened when others spoke. It wasn't that she looked like Grace, not exactly. Grace had been more spontaneous, her laughter louder, her touch lighter. Madeline was steadier, composed, with a quietness that seemed born from its own kind of loss. Yet something in her carried the same warmth, that unspoken gentleness, like sunlight filtering through closed curtains. Daniel tried to ignore it, tried to bury the ache that rose every time she smiled. But grief has a strange way of shifting shape. It can disguise itself as curiosity, as fascination, even as hope. And soon, he found himself watching for small details, as if the answers might be hidden there. One afternoon, during a team briefing, she brushed a stray hair behind her ear, revealing the faintest scar just below her jawline, a thin line, almost invisible, like a memory etched into skin. He stared at it too long, wondering how she got it, before she looked up suddenly, meeting his eyes. For a moment, he thought she saw straight through him, the questions, the longing, the quiet desperation he tried to hide. But she only smiled politely, then looked away. That night, he couldn't sleep. He sat by the window of his small house, a blanket around his shoulders, watching the lights of passing cars blur across the wet road. On the table beside him lay an old photo, Grace in the garden, hair blowing in the wind, laughing at something he'd said. Her necklace caught the sunlight in that picture too, glinting just like it had in Madeline's office. He touched the edge of the photograph with his fingertips. Why her? Grace, he whispered. Why now? The wind shifted outside, rustling the trees. He could almost imagine Grace's voice, soft and teasing. Because you weren't done yet, Dan. He laughed under his breath, a broken sound that wasn't quite laughter. I think you're right, he murmured. At work the next morning, he arrived early. The building was still half asleep, the air cool and still. He made coffee in the break room, the sound of the machine filling the quiet. When he turned around, Madeline was standing in the doorway. Early start, she asked, smiling. He nodded. Couldn't sleep. Same, she said softly, stepping inside. The mind doesn't know when to rest sometimes. She poured herself a cup, then stood beside him at the counter. For a while, neither spoke. The silence between them had grown familiar now, not awkward, but alive, as if something unspoken hummed in that space. Finally, Daniel found himself asking, do you ever feel like some people stay with us? Even when they're gone? Madeline turned, her eyes searching his. I think the ones who truly mattered never leave, she said after a pause. They just change where they live. Her words struck something deep inside him. He swallowed hard, pretending to sip his coffee, though his hands had begun to tremble. When she left for her office, he lingered, her words echoing in his mind. They just change where they live. The rest of the day blurred. He answered questions automatically, nodded at conversations he barely heard. But every time Madeline walked by, the air seemed to shift, just slightly. It wasn't attraction, not yet, not fully. It was recognition, the kind that makes you ache and wonder in equal measure. By late afternoon, the sky had turned gray again, rain tapping softly against the windows. Most of the team had left early. Madeline was still in her office, the glow of her desk lamp spilling into the hallway. Daniel hesitated outside her door. Through the glass, he could see her bent over a stack of papers, her expression calm, focused, and there it was, again the necklace, glimmering faintly in the dim light. He thought of the engraving, of Grace's laughter, of that night on the balcony when she'd said, even when two tides drift apart, they find their way home. Maybe this was what she meant. He turned to leave but stopped when her voice floated through the open door. Daniel. Something wrong. He froze. Oh no, I just forgot my coat. She nodded slowly, studying him. You sure you're all right? You've seemed a bit far away lately. He forced a small smile. Just adjusting, I guess. She tilted her head, eyes soft. Sometimes starting over feels heavier than it should. But you're doing fine. He nodded, not trusting his voice to answer. As he left, he caught her reflection in the glass, the calm tilt of her head, the glint of silver at her throat, and for a split second, the image overlapped with Grace's face in his memory. The two merged, not perfectly, but enough to make his heart ache. that night, back home. Daniel stood again by the window. The rain hadn't stopped. He watched the drops slide down the glass, tracing paths that met and separated, like lives crossing for a moment before drifting apart again. He whispered into the dark, "You were right, Grace. The flaw makes it real." And as the sound of rain deepened, he felt it that strange pull again, toward Madeline, toward understanding, toward something that felt like the beginning of forgiveness. He didn't know what he was searching for. Not exactly, maybe not a person, maybe just a connection. But he knew this. He couldn't stop now. The truth, whatever it was calling him, quietly, patiently, through her. And when he finally fell asleep on the couch near dawn, the last thing he saw was her face in the rain-streaked glass, half Grace, half Madeline, and the faint glow of a blue stone shimmering just above her heart. It was a Tuesday afternoon, the kind that drifted by in slow motion, sunlight falling in long stripes across the office floor. Outside, a light rain had passed, leaving the windows streaked and the air smelling faintly of pine. Daniel sat at his desk, pretending to type, though the words on his screen had blurred into nonsense hours ago. His eyes kept sliding toward Madeline's office door. She was inside, reading something, her posture calm, focused. Every so often she'd tuck a strand of hair behind her ear, and the silver chain at her neck would move, catching the light like a quiet heartbeat. He couldn't stop wondering anymore. Weeks had passed since that night he'd seen the engraving D&G, the proof that her necklace was Grace's. But how he'd built 100 explanations in his mind, and none of them made sense. He'd thought of asking her a dozen times, but every time he tried, the words refused to leave his throat. That afternoon, though, something in him shifted. Maybe it was the stillness of the rain, or the way the air inside the building felt heavy, expectant. Or maybe he was just tired of carrying a question that had begun to feel like a weight. When lunch came, the office emptied out, leaving only the faint hum of the vending machine and the ticking clock on the wall. Daniel found himself walking toward her office, one step, then another, his heartbeat keeping pace with his footsteps. He knocked gently. "Come in," she said, her voice warm, distracted. She looked up from her papers as he entered, smiling the kind of smile that always seemed to come from somewhere honest. "Daniel? Everything okay?" He nodded, though his mouth was dry. "Yeah. I wanted to ask you something." She gestured toward the chair across from her desk. "Sure." "What's on your mind?" He sat, the chair creaking softly beneath him. His fingers traced the edge of the folder in his lap. He wasn't sure how to start, so he said the first words that felt steady enough to speak. "That necklace you wear? It's beautiful." Madeline smiled faintly, glancing down at it. "Thank you. My mother gave it to me." Daniel's heart stuttered. He hesitated, then said quietly, "Do you know where she got it?" Madeline blinked, surprised by the question. "I'm not sure," she said after a moment. "She said it was special, something she wanted me to have." Daniel swallowed hard. His voice dropped lower, almost a whisper. "Does it have any markings on the back?" Maybe her brow furrowed slightly. "I don't think so." "Why?" He leaned forward, trying to sound casual, but his words trembled. "I used to know someone who had one just like it. Same stone, same shape. Even a small dent near the clasp, like a crescent moon." Madeline froze. Her fingers went instinctively to the back of her neck, brushing the chain as if to check. A dent, she repeated softly. "And there were initials engraved," Daniel added, his voice breaking a little. "D&G." For a moment, the room went utterly still. Madeline's eyes lifted to his. The warmth that usually lived there seemed to falter, replaced by something fragile confusion first, then realization. She reached up again, unhooking the clasp with unsteady hands. The necklace slid into her palm. She turned it over slowly, eyes narrowing as she searched. Then she saw it. Her lips parted. She said nothing, but the color drained slightly from her face. She looked up again, her expression somewhere between disbelief and unease. You said D&G? Daniel nodded. His heart felt like it was beating in his throat. Yes. Madeline looked back down at the necklace, thumb brushing the faint engraving, the small dent that matched his description exactly. She took a slow breath, then another. My mother gave this to me when I was in college, she said softly. She said it belonged to someone she cared about, someone who meant something to her. Her voice grew quieter, almost a whisper. I never asked more. It just felt comforting. Somehow. Daniel stared at her, the air thick between them. Do you know her name? He asked gently. Madeline nodded. Grace, she said. Grace Miller. The name hit him like a wave, familiar. Tender. Shattering. He closed his eyes for a second, the world tilting beneath him. Grace Miller. He repeated under his breath, almost reverently. When he opened his eyes, Madeline was still watching him, confusion deepening. You knew her, she said quietly. It wasn't a question. Daniel nodded once. She was my fiancée. For a long time, neither of them moved. The only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioning, and somewhere outside, the steady rhythm of rain. Madeline looked down at the necklace again, her fingers trembling. I didn't know, she whispered. I swear, I didn't know. I believe you, Daniel said softly. His voice was steady now, though inside, everything felt like it was unraveling and knitting itself together all at once. How did you? She began, but stopped herself, shaking her head. No, I don't even know how to ask. He gave a small, weary smile. Neither do I. The silence that followed wasn't heavy this time. It was fragile, yes, but full of something else. Too. Understanding. Maybe. Connection. Madeline turned the necklace over again in her hands, as if seeing it for the first time. She must have been important to my mother, she said quietly. She never talked much about the past, but sometimes she'd mention a friend someone she met years ago when she was volunteering at a summer camp. She said that girl had the kindest eyes she'd ever seen. Daniel felt his chest tighten, a lump rising in his throat. That sounds like her, he whispered. Madeline nodded, her eyes glistening faintly. Then, maybe it's not a coincidence, she said softly. He met her gaze, and for a brief, trembling moment, it felt as if time folded the past and present touching edges. Outside, the rain slowed to a drizzle, the sunlight breaking through faintly, casting reflections across the window. Madeline closed her hand around the necklace, holding it gently. I think, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, it was meant to find its way to you again. Daniel didn't answer. He just watched her, the faint light playing across her face, and in that quiet moment, something in him shifted, not the end of grief, but the beginning of grace. And as the last drops of rain traced slow paths down the glass, both of them sat there, silent, the space between them carrying a truth neither of them had sought but somehow had been waiting for, all along. The room was quiet except for the sound of rain against the glass. The world outside had turned gray, but inside Madeline's office, a single lamp cast a soft amber light across her desk. The necklace lay between them, still glimmering faintly, like it held a pulse of its own. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Daniel sat back, hands clasped tightly, afraid to move, afraid to breathe wrong and shatter the fragile air between them. Madeline kept her gaze on the silver chain in her palm, her thumb brushing the blue stone gently, as if it might explain itself if she touched it long enough. Finally, she spoke quiet, almost to herself. When I was 16, my mom sent me to a summer camp in Virginia. Blue Ridge Camp. It was the kind of place that smelled like pine and wet earth, where the air stayed cool even in July. Daniel lifted his eyes. Her voice had changed softer, layered with memory. There was a girl there. Madeline continued. Grace Miller. We shared a cabin. She was different from the others, quieter. But with this light in her, you know those people who make the world feel softer just by standing in it. Daniel nodded slowly. He did know. Madeline smiled faintly. She used to sneak out after lights out, down to the lake. Said the stars looked closer from the water. I followed her one night. We sat on the dock, our feet dangling, watching our reflections ripple. She told me about her dream to open a home someday for kids who had no one, a place that felt like family. Her voice caught slightly. I remember thinking she was too good for this world. Daniel felt something tighten in his chest. That sounded exactly like Grace, her heart, her hope, her way of dreaming for others more than herself. Madeline traced the edge of the pendant with her finger. We wrote letters after camp for a while, but life, it got in the way. I went to college. She did too. Then one day, the letters stopped. She paused, staring at nothing for a moment. Years later, I saw her name again in the paper. The obituary section. Grace Miller, 27, car accident. Her voice was barely a whisper now. Daniel closed his eyes, his throat tightening. Yeah, he said softly. That was her. Madeline nodded, as if she'd known, somewhere deep down. I went to find her mother, Mrs. Miller. She lived in a little white house near the edge of town. The garden was overgrown, like time had stopped there. She took a shaky breath. When she opened the door, she looked so much like Grace it almost took my breath away. I told her who I was, that I used to know her daughter. We sat in her kitchen for hours, drinking tea and talking. She showed me old photos, Grace as a child, Grace at graduation, Grace with a man she said was her fiancé. Madeline looked up, meeting Daniel's eyes. It was you. Daniel didn't move. He couldn't. The memory of that photograph, the one Grace's mother had taken in their backyard. Grace leaning against him, laughing, flickered in his mind like a ghost. Madeline continued, her tone fragile but steady. Before I left, she went into her bedroom and came back with this necklace. She held it for a long time before handing it to me. She said, "Keep it with someone who remembers her with love, not sorrow." I didn't understand what she meant then. I just knew it mattered. She let the words hang there. The air was heavy, but tender. Daniel leaned forward, his voice barely audible. "And you've worn it ever since." Madeline nodded. "Not every day, but on days when I needed strength, somehow, it always felt like a reminder that kindness doesn't vanish, that love leaves traces." He smiled faintly, the corners of his eyes wet. Grace would have liked that. Madeline looked at him, then really looked at him, and something unspoken passed between them. Grief recognizing itself, hope finding a fragile home in its shadow. The rain outside softened to a drizzle. A beam of sunlight broke through, casting faint reflections across the window. The blue stone in her hand caught it, glowing with a light that seemed almost alive. For the first time, Daniel didn't feel the sharp edge of loss when he saw it. Instead, he felt something else, a warmth rising slowly through the ache. Madeline set the necklace gently on the desk between them. "I think," she said quietly, "it was never really about who had it. Maybe it was about who still carried her with them." Daniel nodded, his voice thick. "Maybe she just wanted to make sure none of us forgot how to love." They sat there in silence again, listening to the rain fade into the distance. The world outside the glass felt softer now, washed clean. Somehow, after a while, Madeline clasped the necklace back around her neck, her fingers lingering on the clasp. "Your Grace," she said. Looking at him, she changed lives, even ones she never meant to touch. Daniel smiled through his tears. "Yeah," he said softly. "That sounds like her." The clock ticked quietly in the background. A bird landed on the ledge outside, shaking water from its feathers before taking off again. And in that gentle, ordinary moment, surrounded by the hum of the world coming back to life, Daniel realized that the past wasn't haunting him anymore. It was guiding him. The necklace, the memories, even the pain, they weren't anchors now. They were bridges. He looked at Madeline, this woman who'd unknowingly carried a piece of Grace's heart all these years, and felt something shift inside him. A small, steady peace. Outside, the sky began to clear, revealing the faintest blush of blue through the thinning clouds. And Daniel thought maybe this was how love survived, by finding new hands, new hearts, new ways to keep shining. He breathed in, slow and deep, letting the air fill the empty spaces grief had hollowed out. Across from him, Madeline smiled, quiet, kind, and full of something Grace once called the light that stays. Neither of them spoke again. They didn't need to, because some truths, once shared, don't need words to live. The days that followed unfolded with a quiet gentleness neither of them expected. It began with small things, a few words exchanged over morning coffee, brief smiles in the hallway, the kind that lingered just long enough to warm the day. But soon, the conversation stretched longer. Sometimes, in the late afternoon, when the office had emptied and the hum of computers faded, Daniel would find himself sitting across from Madeline, the world outside their window, turning golden with sunset. They talked about Grace, not in the heavy, sorrowful way people usually speak of those who've passed, but in a tone light with memory, with warmth. Daniel told stories of her little habits, how she used to hum Sinatra songs while washing dishes, how she hated cold pizza but loved the smell of coffee at midnight, how she once painted their apartment door the wrong shade of blue but insisted it felt happier that way. Madeline laughed softly, the sound like rain falling on glass. "That sounds like her," she'd say. And sometimes she would add her own stories, fragments from summers long ago. She used to tie her hair with a red ribbon every morning. Madeline recalled one evening, said it reminded her of her mother's garden back home. And she'd drag me out to the lake after lunch, even when it was too hot. She'd dive in and float on her back, just staring at the sky. Daniel smiled. "Yeah, she used to do that on the coast, too." Said the clouds looked like stories waiting to be told. They both went quiet then, lost in their own images of her different memories. Same girl. The silence between them was soft, not uncomfortable. As days turned to weeks, they began to find comfort in these talks, a rhythm that felt natural, healing. Daniel noticed how sharing Grace's memory didn't hurt anymore. It no longer tore open the wound. It smoothed it, made it breathable. One afternoon, as they stood by the office window watching rain blur the city, Madeline said quietly, "You know, grief changes shape. I used to think it was something to move through. Now, I think it's something that moves with us." Daniel nodded. Grace used to say love's like the tide. It goes out, but it always finds its way back. Madeline smiled faintly. "She said that to me once, too, at camp. We were talking about friendship. She said, even when two tides drift apart, they still belong to the same ocean." The words caught in Daniel's chest. For a long moment, he couldn't speak. The phrase, the same one Grace had whispered to him the night he proposed, echoed through him like a heartbeat that hadn't faded. He looked at Madeline then, and in her eyes he saw it, not Grace's reflection, but her essence, that same quiet strength, that same understanding. That evening, they left the office together for the first time. It wasn't planned. They just happened to reach the parking lot at the same time, the air cool and damp from the rain. Madeline suggested a cafe nearby, a small, dimly lit place with old records playing in the background. Over cups of coffee, they spoke of other things: work, childhood, the little moments that made up the corners of their lives. It felt easy, unforced. Daniel found himself laughing, really laughing, for the first time in years. At one point, Madeline said, "You know what's strange when you talk about her? I don't feel sad. I feel lucky, like I got to know a part of her through you." Daniel smiled. the ache in his chest gentle now. And I think, through you, I'm learning to remember her without breaking. The cafe grew quieter as the night went on. Outside, streetlights flickered on, their reflections stretching across the wet pavement. Madeline glanced at her watch but didn't move. I should go, she said softly, though she made no effort to stand. Yeah, Daniel murmured, me too. Neither did. Instead, they sat there a little longer, both aware that something invisible had shifted, not a beginning, not yet, but a fragile bridge between two lives that had once been strangers, now bound by someone they both loved. When they finally stepped out into the cool air, the rain had stopped. The sky was clear again, stars faint but steady above the city. Madeline turned to him, her hands tucked into her coat pockets. Do you ever think, she asked, that people come back to us in different ways, not as ghosts but as reminders? Little pieces of them we find in others, Daniel thought for a moment. Maybe they never really leave, he said. Maybe they just shift places. Madeline smiled, and for the first time, Daniel felt no sharp edge of loss in that smile. Only gratitude. They said goodnight, their cars parked side by side, and for a brief moment before she drove off, he caught sight of the necklace again, glinting in the streetlight. He didn't flinch this time. Instead, he felt something close to peace, the kind that comes not from forgetting, but from remembering gently. That night, back home, he sat by the window, the same place he used to sit when the silence felt unbearable. But tonight, the quiet didn't press against him. It breathed with him. He thought of Grace, her laughter, her dreams, her endless belief in love, and then he thought of Madeline, steady, kind, carrying Grace's light forward in ways neither of them could have foreseen. Somewhere deep inside, Daniel realized the two were no longer separate in his heart. Grace had been his beginning. Madeline was what came after the part that taught him how to keep living. He closed his eyes, the faint hum of the city in the distance, and whispered a thank you into the dark, not to anyone in particular, but to all that remained. Outside, the moon slipped free from the clouds, and its pale light filled the room, landing gently on the framed photo of Grace on the shelf. Her smile seemed softer somehow, almost approving. Daniel smiled back, and as the night settled around him, he felt it, that quiet truth rising through the stillness. Grief, when shared, doesn't divide love. It multiplies it. The early spring air carried a gentleness that made everything feel lighter, as if the world itself was exhaling after a long winter. The cherry trees lining the street outside Aurora Financial had begun to bloom, pale pink petals scattering across the sidewalks, softening even the city's hard edges. Daniel found himself noticing small things like that again, the way sunlight touched the tops of buildings, the warmth of his coffee mug in the morning, the laughter that sometimes drifted from Madeline's office. Their conversations had become a quiet rhythm now. After work, they would slip out to the same cafe, the one with mismatched chairs and an old record player that always seemed to hum just a little off-key. Sometimes they talked for hours, other times, only a few minutes passed between long stretches of silence that didn't feel empty. The kind of silence that lets two hearts breathe at the same pace. One evening, as they sat by the window, Daniel mentioned something he hadn't spoken aloud in years. Grace had this dream, he said softly, tracing the rim of his coffee cup. She wanted to build a home for kids who had no one. She called it Haven House. Madeline leaned forward, her eyes lighting with quiet curiosity. What kind of home? Not an orphanage, Daniel said. She hated that word. She wanted a place that felt like belonging, where kids could be seen, not just cared for. Madeline smiled faintly. Grace would have loved the work we do now. You know that Daniel nodded? Yeah. She believed in giving people second chances. I guess she'd think this job was one of mine. The conversation lingered between them like a shared candle flame. Then Madeline said softly, "What if Haven House didn't have to stay just a dream?" Daniel looked up. surprised. "What do you mean?" She shrugged lightly, but her tone held conviction. "What if we found a way to make it real, even if it starts small? A fund, a program, something to honor her? You said she wanted to help children. Maybe we can—" For a moment, Daniel didn't answer. His heart beat faster, not from grief this time, but from something that felt like purpose stirring awake. He smiled, a little unsure but hopeful. "You really think we could?" Madeline's eyes softened. Grace believed in possibility. Maybe that's what she left behind, the faith that we still can. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. He sat by the window again, but this time the silence didn't ache. It hummed with something new, an energy he hadn't felt since before the accident. Grace's name didn't feel like a wound anymore. It felt like a direction. In the following weeks, he and Madeline began sketching ideas. They met after work, their laptops open, notebooks spread across the table. Haven House was written in bold letters at the top of the page. Grace's vision began to take shape in their words: a mentorship program for foster kids aging out of the system, workshops on life skills, financial support for college. Each idea built upon the last, and each meeting drew them closer. There were moments when Daniel would glance at her, at the way she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, or the small crease that appeared between her brows when she was focused, and something inside him would tighten. It wasn't grief. It wasn't even longing. It was something gentler, quieter, but no less powerful. One evening, as the sun melted into the horizon, painting the office in amber light, he realized he was beginning to feel again, and it terrified him. Because beneath the warmth growing between them was a question he didn't dare ask. Was this allowed? He'd loved Grace with all that he was. He had promised her forever. And now, sitting across from Madeline, this woman who carried a piece of Grace's light, yet was wholly her own. He wondered if letting his heart stir again meant betraying that promise. Madeline must have felt it too. There were moments she'd glance at him, then look away too quickly. Times her laughter would falter mid-sound, her gaze drifting to the necklace at her collarbone, the one that had once belonged to Grace. One Friday evening, they stayed late finalizing the first draft of their proposal. The building was quiet, the hum of the air conditioner the only sound. When they finally stood to leave, Daniel reached for his jacket at the same time Madeline did. Their hands brushed a small, accidental touch, but it froze both of them in place. For a heartbeat, neither moved. She looked up at him, eyes wide, vulnerable. The air between them felt charged, not with guilt, not with confusion, but with something that had been waiting quietly, patient and kind. Daniel's breath hitched. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words tangled somewhere between fear and desire. Madeline stepped back, her voice barely a whisper. "We should go." He nodded, his pulse loud in his ears. "Yeah, we should." They walked to the parking lot in silence, the air cool and heavy with the scent of rain. The glow of the streetlights stretched their shadows long across the pavement. Before getting into her car, Madeline turned to him, her voice trembling. "Daniel, if we keep doing this project together, I need to know we're doing it for Grace, not because we're both lonely." He met her eyes steady, quiet. "It's for her," he said. Then, after a pause, added, "But maybe it's also for us." She didn't reply. She only gave a small nod, the kind that carried both trust and fear, before stepping into her car. As her taillights disappeared down the road, Daniel stood there under the faint drizzle, the echo of her words still in the air. He knew she was right. Love, like grief, demanded honesty, and whatever this was, whatever was awakening between them, it couldn't be built on ghosts. He tilted his head back, eyes closing against the soft rain. The sound reminded him of that night years ago, the night Grace had whispered her promise by the ocean. Even when two tides drift apart, they find their way home, he wondered, as the drops touched his face. If maybe this was what she had meant all along. Not that love ends, but that it changes. It learns to live again. And as Daniel finally walked to his car, A single line of thought followed him into the quiet night. Gentle, certain, unspoken. Grace hadn't sent him backward. She'd sent him forward. The day began like any other. The smell of coffee drifting through the office, the soft click of keyboards, sunlight pressing through the blinds. But when Madeline's phone rang just before noon, something in her chest tightened. The name on the screen made her breath catch Margaret Miller. She hadn't heard from Grace's mother in years. The last time they spoke, Mrs. Miller's voice had been warm but fragile, like she was carrying the weight of the whole world and still trying to smile through it. Madeline hesitated before answering, her fingers trembling slightly. Mrs. Miller. Madeline, dear. The voice came, soft and frail. It's been too long. Madeline's throat tightened. How are you? There was a pause, a quiet that said more than words could. Then, gently, I'm near the end of my road. Sweetheart, the doctors say it's time I rest. Madeline felt her heart sink. She gripped the edge of her desk. I'm so sorry, she whispered. Don't be, the older woman said, her tone calm, almost peaceful. I've had a long life. And Grace, her voice trembled slightly. Grace is waiting for me. But before I go, there's something I need you to do. The next afternoon, Madeline drove the 3 hours to Mrs. Miller's home, the little white house with the peeling paint and the overgrown garden. The same place she'd visited all those years ago when she first learned Grace was gone. Time had softened everything, the fence now covered in ivy. The porch steps worn smooth from years of use. Mrs. Miller sat in a chair by the window, a blanket over her legs, sunlight pooling at her feet. She looked smaller now, her silver hair thin and wispy. But her eyes, those same kind, ocean-colored eyes Grace had, were still bright. You came, she said softly as Madeline entered. Of course I did, Madeline said, kneeling beside her. She took the woman's hand, warm and trembling. They talked for a while about Grace, about the years that had passed, about how life had quietly folded in on itself, but never fully closed. Then Mrs. Miller reached into the pocket of her cardigan and pulled out a small white envelope, yellowed at the edges. Her handwriting, though faded, was careful, deliberate. Across the front, in soft blue ink, were 4 simple words, for Daniel Brooks. Madeline froze. This is Mrs. Miller nodded. Grace wrote it not long before the accident. She asked me to give it to him someday. I didn't know when the right time would be, but I think now it is. Madeline took the envelope gently, feeling its lightness, as though it carried both the weight of a life and the tenderness of goodbye. Mrs. Miller smiled faintly. You've seen him, haven't you, Daniel? Madeline hesitated, then nodded. Yes. We work together now. The old woman's eyes softened, the corners crinkling with something like understanding. Then you'll know what to do. She rested her hand over Madeline's. Grace loved him deeply, but she also knew love wasn't meant to keep us trapped. Promise me you'll give it to him. When your heart tells you it's time, Madeline blinked back tears. I promise. Mrs. Miller smiled, her breathing slow, steady. Good. Because love doesn't die. Dear. It just changes homes. Later, as Madeline drove back through the winding Oregon roads, the envelope rested on the passenger seat beside her. The sky was painted with soft gray clouds, the kind that threatened rain but held off, waiting, every mile. She found herself glancing at the letter, wondering what words Grace had left behind, what message she had carried across all these years. When she reached her apartment that evening, she didn't open it, she set it on her nightstand, beside a photo of her younger self at Blue Ridge Camp. Grace beside her, both of them laughing, sunburned and barefoot by the lake. That night, she dreamed of that summer. She saw Grace running along the dock, water droplets catching the sunlight like sparks, and she heard her voice clear, calm, full of life. Tell him to live again. Promise me you'll tell him." Madeline woke with tears on her cheeks. The dawn light spilled softly into her room, washing everything in gold. She turned toward the letter, still unopened, and whispered, "I will." The next day at work, she found Daniel in the small garden behind the building, the same one with the lavender and mint he'd always loved. He was sitting on the bench, lost in thought, his eyes distant but peaceful. Madeline approached quietly, the envelope in her hand. When he looked up, she saw something in his expression, the same quiet strength Grace once carried. "There's something I need to give you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He frowned gently, curious, then watched as she extended the letter toward him. "It's from Grace," she said. "Her mother gave it to me yesterday." Daniel's breath caught. His hands trembled as he took the envelope. For a long moment, he simply held it, tracing the edges, as if afraid it might disappear. Then he opened it carefully. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded neatly. The handwriting was hers unmistakable, looped letters, steady lines. He felt his throat tighten as he began to read. "My love, if this letter ever reaches you, it means life has carried us to different shores. But please know, wherever I am, I'm smiling at the thought of you. Don't let grief turn you into a ghost of the man you are. Promise me you'll live again. Promise me you'll love again. Because love doesn't die. Daniel, it just changes shape." His hands trembled as he read it a second time, then a third. By the fourth. He couldn't see the words anymore, only the blur of tears that refused to stop. Madeline sat beside him, silent. She didn't touch him, didn't speak. She just stayed her presence quiet, steady, real. After a long while, Daniel folded the letter carefully and held it to his chest. The ache inside him was still there, but softer now, like the tide retreating after years of crashing against the same shore. He looked at Madeline, eyes shining with both pain and peace. "She wanted me to live," he whispered. "She wanted this." Madeline nodded. She did. The garden was still, the air fragrant with lavender. Somewhere nearby, a bird began to sing a simple, trembling note that rose into the morning light. Daniel closed his eyes, listening, and in that quiet, he understood love was never meant to be owned. It was meant to be continued. When he opened his eyes again, the world looked different, softer, wider, full of light. He looked at Madeline, and she smiled not as a replacement for what he'd lost, but as a reflection of what still remained. And in that small, perfect moment, Daniel felt it the gentle truth that Grace had always known. Love, real love, doesn't end. It simply finds a new way to stay. The garden was quiet that evening. A soft wind moved through the lavender, brushing against Daniel's sleeve like a memory trying to speak. The sun was slipping low, painting everything in gold, the kind of light that makes even grief look gentle. Daniel still sat on the same bench where Madeline had given him the letter, the paper now folded neatly in his hands. He had read it once, twice, 3 times, and each time, it struck a different part of him. It wasn't the words that undid him. It was the voice behind them, Grace's voice, alive between the lines, as if she were still there, steady and kind, telling him what he had refused to believe for so long. It's okay to live again. Madeline stood nearby, unsure whether to move closer or give him space. She could see his shoulders shaking, the way he clutched the letter to his chest. His breath came unevenly, caught between sobs and silence. It wasn't the quiet cry of someone grieving. It was the breaking open of years, a dam finally giving way. She walked closer, her steps careful, until she was beside him. He didn't look up. "She knew," he said hoarsely. "She knew I'd get stuck there." In that moment, Madeline nodded, her own throat tight. "She loved you enough to let you go." Daniel let out a sound that was that part laugh, part cry. I kept thinking moving on would mean leaving her behind. But this, he held the letter up slightly, the paper trembling in his hand. "It's her telling me she never left." Madeline sat down beside him. The air smelled of mint and rain, the light fading slow. Grace wasn't the kind of person who believed in endings. She said quietly. She believed everything continues, just in a different form. Daniel turned his head, finally meeting her gaze. For the first time in years, his eyes were wet but unguarded, open in a way that made him look both older and lighter. Maybe that's what this is, he whispered, her finding a way to keep me moving. They sat in silence for a long while, the evening deepening around them. The first stars began to appear, faint and flickering above the city skyline. Somewhere in the distance, a car passed, its sound fading into the hum of night. Madeline finally said, "You know, when her mom gave me that letter, she said something I didn't understand until now." "What was that?" "She said, 'Love doesn't die, dear. It just changes homes.'" Daniel closed his eyes, breathing in those words. She was right. The wind shifted then, carrying with it the faintest echo of laughter. Grace's laughter, or maybe just the sound of leaves brushing against each other. He couldn't tell, but for the first time, it didn't hurt to hear it. He looked down at the letter again, Grace's handwriting those careful loops. The steady pressure of her pen felt alive beneath his fingertips. He could almost see her at their old kitchen table, candlelight flickering beside her, writing those final lines. She must have known he would need them someday. "I wish I could tell her thank you," he said softly. Madeline smiled, her voice low. "I think you just did." The night settled gently around them. Daniel leaned back, the exhaustion of years of holding in tears finally giving way to something softer. Peace. Not the kind that erases pain, but the kind that accepts it. After a while, he folded the letter carefully and slipped it into his jacket pocket. He turned to Madeline. "You know, she always said the world was full of second chances. I never thought she meant me." Madeline met his gaze. Maybe she did. He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that begins small but reaches the eyes. "I don't know where this goes from here, but I think I'm ready to find out." Madeline nodded, one step at a time. They stayed there until the lights of the office building flicked off. The garden bathed in moonlight now. Daniel stood, breathing deeply, the scent of lavender filling his lungs. It no longer smelled like loss. It smelled like beginnings. He turned to her. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what? For bringing her back to me, for helping me see that she never really left." Madeline's eyes softened. "She wanted you to have peace. I just carried her message." He shook his head gently. "No, you carried hope." The words hung between them, quiet and steady. Later that night, Daniel drove home with the window down, the cool air rushing in. The city lights blurred past like fireflies. On the passenger seat lay the letter, the corner of it glowing under the dashboard light. He glanced at it once, then smiled. When he reached home, he placed the letter inside the photo frame on his nightstand, behind the picture of Grace at the beach, her hair caught in the wind. He whispered into the stillness, "You can rest now." And then, for the first time in years, he slept deeply, not from exhaustion, but from release. The next morning, he woke to sunlight spilling across the room. It felt like a new kind of morning. Quiet. Clear. He made coffee, opened the window, and watched the world wake up. There was no ghost in the room, no ache heavy in his chest. Just memory soft, constant, but no longer cruel. When he arrived at work, Madeline was already there, standing by the window with 2 cups of coffee. She turned, smiled, and handed him one. "Morning," she said. "Morning," he replied. His voice was lighter. They looked out over the city together. For a long time, neither spoke, and then, quietly, Daniel said, "You know, I think she'd be happy we met." Madeline's smile deepened. "I think so too." The light caught the silver chain around her neck, the same one Grace had once worn. Daniel looked at it, but this time there was no sting, no shadow, only warmth. He reached out, gently touching the pendant between his fingers. "The flaw makes it real," he murmured. Madeline looked surprised. "You know that phrase. He nodded. She said it to me once. Madeline smiled softly. She said it to me, too. They both laughed quietly, then a sound full of shared understanding, of lives intersecting through love and loss and the strange mercy of time. And in that laughter, something invisible but certain lifted the last weight of the past, the quiet arrival of freedom. As they stood there in the morning light, Daniel realized Grace hadn't just left him a letter, she'd left him a bridge, one that led him back to life. And beside him now, breathing the same air, was the person who helped him cross it. The morning sky was brushed with gold when Daniel stood before the new building, its windows glinting like ripples on calm water. The sign above the entrance read, Grace Haven Center in soft silver letters, and beneath it, the tagline they had chosen together, a place to belong. For a long moment, Daniel just stood there, hands in his pockets, breathing in the crisp air that smelled faintly of pine and fresh paint. Around him, volunteers moved back and forth, arranging chairs, hanging balloons, checking sound systems. Laughter echoed through the open courtyard. It was a sound he hadn't heard around his name in a long time. Madeline walked up beside him, holding 2 paper cups of coffee. "You're early," she said with a smile. He took 1 cup from her, his fingers brushing hers. "Couldn't sleep," he admitted. She glanced at the building, her expression soft. "Neither could I." They stood there for a while, watching as the last banner was tied to the front gate. The words, "Grand Opening," swayed gently in the morning breeze. Daniel spoke first. "Do you remember the first night we talked about this?" Madeline laughed softly. "Of course. You had a sketch on a napkin, and you told me it looked like a school built by a 5-year-old. She smiled. "It did. But you wouldn't stop talking about it." He chuckled quietly. "I guess I didn't." His gaze drifted upward again, to the name carved in silver. "Grace Haven," he said under his breath. She would have liked it. Madeline's eyes followed his. "She would have been proud," she said. There was a small ceremony that morning, nothing grand, just enough to mark a beginning. A handful of local families came, some donors, and a few of the children who would soon call the center their second home. The air was full of murmurs, greetings, the soft shuffle of chairs. When it was time for Daniel to speak, he stood behind the simple wooden podium placed near the entrance. For a moment, he couldn't find his voice. His hands trembled slightly on the paper in front of him. But then he caught sight of Madeline standing a few feet away, her eyes steady, encouraging. He drew in a breath and began. "2 years ago," he said quietly, "I didn't think I'd ever stand in a place like this again. Grief has a way of convincing you that everything good ended with what you lost. But sometimes, loss becomes the soil where something new grows." A pause. The crowd listened in stillness. "This center isn't just a building. It's a promise one that Grace made long before I was ready to believe in it. She dreamed of a home for children who needed love as much as they needed safety. A place that would remind them they matter, even when the world forgets to say so." He stopped for a breath, his throat tightening. "But what I didn't know was that this dream would come back to me, carried by someone who turned memory into light." He looked at Madeline then, and their eyes met a quiet, shared understanding passing between them. "Madeline," he said, voice low but firm, "you've done something extraordinary. You didn't just help me build this. You helped me believe again." The words hung there, weightless yet full. The crowd was silent, moved by something unspoken, the sight of 2 people standing not at the end of a story, but at the start of one born from loss, love, and courage. When the ribbon was cut, the crowd applauded. Children ran through the open doors, their laughter echoing through the halls, their small hands leaving smudges on freshly painted walls. Daniel watched them, a smile tugging at his lips. For the first time, he didn't think of Grace with pain. He thought of her as part of this woven into every laugh, every light, every brick. Madeline walked up beside him again. "You okay?" she asked softly. He nodded, eyes glistening. "Yeah, I think I am." They wandered through the halls together after the ceremony. The walls were decorated with hand-painted murals, soft blues, greens, and golds. In one corner, a framed photograph of Grace rested on a shelf beside a small plaque that read, "In memory of Grace Miller, who believed love could change the world." Daniel stopped there, his fingertips brushing the frame. "You did it, Grace," he whispered. "You finally did it." Madeline stood quietly beside him, letting him have the moment. Then she spoke, her voice tender. "You know, when I was a kid, Grace used to talk about building something like this. I thought it was just one of her wild dreams." Daniel smiled faintly. "She had a lot of those." "She did," Madeline said, "but she also had this way of making people believe they could be more than they thought." He looked at her. "She still does." They continued down the hallway, passing classrooms filled with art supplies, shelves of books, a small kitchen space where children would soon learn to cook simple meals. It was all so alive, so full of promise. When they reached the courtyard, Daniel paused again, feeling the sunlight on his face. "You know what I realized today," he said. "What that grief doesn't shrink over time. It just makes room for other things, for gratitude, for peace, for love." Madeline smiled gently. "Maybe that's what healing really is." He nodded. "Yeah, maybe it is." For a while, they stood there, listening to the laughter echoing from the classrooms. A little boy ran past them, clutching a paper airplane, his laughter carrying across the courtyard. Daniel watched him disappear into the light, and something inside him settled. He turned to Madeline, his voice soft. "Thank you." She looked at him. "For what?" "For helping me turn memory into light." The words came easily, naturally, and when he said them, she smiled, not with surprise, but with quiet understanding, as if she'd been waiting for him to find those words on his own. The day faded slowly, the sky turning the same pale blue as the stone on Grace's old necklace. The last guests left, and the building grew still again. Daniel and Madeline lingered by the gate, neither wanting to leave. "Finally," Madeline said. "You think Grace would approve of the paint color?" Daniel laughed. A real laugh this time, light and unguarded. "She'd probably tell us we should have gone with yellow." Madeline smiled. "Yeah. She always loved yellow." They both looked back at the building one last time, Grace Haven Center glowing softly under the streetlights, alive with the hum of possibility. Daniel took a deep breath. The ache that had lived in his chest for years felt different now, not gone, but gentler, like a familiar song that no longer hurt to hear. And as they walked toward their cars, the night settling around them, Daniel thought of Grace, of her laughter, her courage, her light. He whispered into the quiet, almost to himself, "We did it." And somewhere deep inside, he could almost hear her answer, that same calm voice, full of love. "You finally came home." The lavender fields stretched wide beneath a late summer sky, the air thick with that soft, familiar scent, calm and sweet. The same way it had been the day Daniel first stepped into Aurora's garden years ago. Only this time, there was no ache in his chest, only warmth, only peace. The guests had gathered by the small lake, its surface shimmering beneath the sun. The ceremony was simple, just a few wooden chairs, wildflowers in mason jars, a white arch draped in soft linen that swayed with the breeze. Daniel stood at the edge of the path, his hands steady now, his heart open. Beside him, Madeline walked toward him in a simple ivory dress, the sunlight catching strands of her hair and turning them gold. She wasn't Grace, and she never had to be. She was Madeline, the woman who had found him when he was lost and shown him how love could live again. Yet, as she walked closer, Daniel felt no distance between past and present. It was as if every step she took carried both women forward, the one who had loved him first and the one who loved him now. When Madeline reached him, she smiled that same quiet, knowing smile that had once eased his grief. He took her hands, feeling how solid and real they were, and whispered, "You're home?" The ceremony began. Their vows were simple, spoken softly in the open air. No grand declarations, No rehearsed promises, just truth. I used to think love ended when someone left, Daniel said, voice steady but full. But you've taught me that love never leaves. It changes. It grows. It finds its way back through the people who keep believing in it. Madeline's eyes glistened. You once told me the flaw makes it real, she whispered, and now I know that's what love is. Not perfect, just real. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, applause rippled softly through the crowd, warm, tender, full of joy. But in that moment, Daniel heard something else, too a whisper in the wind, faint but familiar, like laughter carried from far away. He didn't turn, he didn't need to. He knew Grace was there, later. As the sun dipped low, the fields glowed in shades of violet and gold. Madeline leaned against Daniel under the oak tree by the water's edge, her hand resting on his chest, her wedding ring catching the last light of the day. Around her neck, the silver necklace gleamed, the same one that had once broken his heart. He reached out, his fingers brushing the pendant gently. It doesn't hurt to see it anymore, he said softly. Madeline smiled. It was never meant to. He nodded, watching the way the light danced across the stone. It's strange. For years, I thought this necklace belonged to my past, but maybe it was always meant to guide me here. They fell silent, letting the sound of crickets and the soft splash of water fill the space between them. The world around them felt whole, every sound, every scent, every breath tied together by something unseen, yet deeply alive. Time passed gently after that. Seasons folded into each other. The Grace Haven Center grew, filled with children's laughter and the smell of fresh-baked bread. The walls carried drawings, small handprints, and words like hope and home. And then, one quiet spring morning, their daughter was born. Daniel remembered holding her for the first time, this tiny, breathing miracle with her mother's eyes and her late fiancé's spirit shining through her smile. When Madeline asked what to name her, the answer came naturally, almost like it had been waiting on his tongue all along. Grace Ann, he whispered. Madeline looked at him, her eyes full. Perfect, she said. Years later, the lavender fields still bloomed around their home, the same hue as the stone that once hung around Grace's neck. The necklace now rested in a small glass case on their daughter's nightstand, not as a relic, but as a reminder. Grace Ann often held it up to the light, fascinated by the way it shimmered. It looks like the sky, she would say. And Daniel would smile, brushing a strand of her hair aside. That's because it carries a piece of it, he'd reply. On quiet evenings, when the sun slipped below the horizon and the fields turned violet, Daniel would sit on the porch, watching Madeline and Grace Ann laugh together in the garden. The laughter would echo across the lake, soft and pure, and something inside him would settle deeper, a peace that came not from forgetting, but from understanding. He often thought of Grace then, of her voice, her courage, her letter. But he didn't feel grief anymore. He felt gratitude for her love, for the life she gave him permission to keep living, for the way she had somehow woven herself into the future she never got to see. One evening, as twilight deepened and the first stars appeared, Madeline joined him on the porch. She leaned her head on his shoulder, and together they watched their daughter chase fireflies by the water. Daniel whispered, almost to himself, "Do you ever think she knows Madeline looked up?" Grace. He nodded. About all of this. About us. Madeline smiled softly. I think she does. I think she's been part of it all along. Daniel exhaled, slow and full. Yeah. I think so too. They fell quiet again. The sound of laughter drifted toward them, mingling with the hum of crickets and the whisper of wind moving through lavender. The air was cool, fragrant, alive, and in that stillness, that perfect ordinary moment, Daniel felt it. The circle had closed. Grace's love hadn't vanished. It had simply transformed from pain to peace, from memory to motion, from goodbye to something eternal. He reached for Madeline's hand, their fingers intertwining. She looked at him and smiled. Come on, she said softly. It's getting dark. He nodded, his gaze lingering on the last streaks of light fading over the lake. The world was quiet, but his heart finally was full. As they walked back toward the house, Daniel turned once more to the horizon. The wind brushed past him, carrying with it the faintest whisper, one he could almost hear, warm and familiar. Live again. Love again. He smiled, and under the soft glow of evening, Daniel Brooks finally understood love doesn't end when life does. It simply finds a new way to shine. As we move through life, loss becomes an inevitable companion, a shadow that visits every heart sooner or later. But Daniel's story reminds us of something deeply human. Love never truly leaves us. It changes shape. It lingers in the laughter we share, the kindness we offer, the courage we find to begin again. Sometimes healing doesn't come from forgetting, but from allowing memory to become light, something that guides us forward instead of pulling us back. The people we've loved don't vanish. They live quietly in the choices we make, in the way we keep loving others after them. Grace taught Daniel that letting go isn't betrayal, it's trust. Trust that life still has beauty waiting, even after heartbreak. Trust that love, in all its forms, is meant to grow, not fade. So, if you've ever lost someone, remember this grief is not the end of love. It's the beginning of understanding how vast love really is. It lives on through kindness, through hope, and through the gentle courage to live again. Thank you so much for spending your time with this story. If it touched your heart, even just a little, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Every click helps these stories of love, loss, and hope reach more hearts that might need a gentle reminder that it's never too late to heal, to forgive, and to begin again. We truly appreciate your support. Stay with us for more heartfelt stories that celebrate the quiet beauty of being human.